You're listening to the Baha'i World News Service.
In this episode, we hear from counsellors Jeffrey Sabor from New Zealand,
True friendship are relationships through which we help each other to grow intellectually and spiritually.
Malona Njung from the Philippines,
Change is not really brought about by individual efforts, but it's in a collective setting.
Natasha Bruce from the United States,
Service is the greatest healing medicine for humanity.
and Nicholas Lowe from Malaysia.
These profound feelings of hope for a better future can inform the choices they make in their lives.
They discuss how communities have been learning about how Baha'i moral and spiritual education programs can help release the potential of youth across the various spheres of their lives. They reflect on how, in neighborhoods and villages, in schools and universities, young people are discovering their spiritual identity, developing their intellectual capacities, and finding meaningful paths of service to their communities. From the Baha'i World News Service, this is In Conversation, a collective exploration of the practical application of Baha'i principles to the building of peaceful societies.
So the Baha'i community has been learning for some time about applying the teachings of Baha'u'llah to bring about the spiritual material progress of society, and in this journey has been working with others in a mode of learning. The Baha'i teachings make clear that youth, young people, play a significant role in the process of social change. In the history of the Baha'i faith, we often see in periods of great progress and creating unity and justice, young people have played a decisive role. And I think this is the case actually for all societies and positive processes of change. But when we think about the path of young people growing up, especially in today's society, while there are forces that can propel their advancement, there are also forces that can disrupt their progress. And we see forces of commercialism, individualism, materialism. We can see that young people at different stages of life can, instead of becoming a cause of social good, can actually kind of get into situations and conditions in life where they're actually accelerating, challenges and processes of disintegration. What we're trying to discover is how do we really help promote the coherence in a young person's life? How can their spiritual identity and their spiritual hopes and aspirations give meaning to the material dimensions of their life, their education, their need to work, their need to engage in family life, and to really find how the spiritual and the material dimensions of life can be in harmony instead of one being in competition. Maybe we can think about some of the programs of education that we've been learning about.
How do we actually do it is based really on our assumptions and perceptions. How do we perceive the youth, for example? The youth, they have that inherent desire to contribute to constructive change, for example. And that they have the actual capacity to serve their communities. But as Jeffrey was saying, how do we now help them resonate with that spiritual identity? So one context to release that power and to release that desire to serve is in the collective. It's not like youth being left to themselves to pursue advancement intellectually or spiritually, but how do the institutions or the community sort of work with these individuals, work with this youth population so that they have a context to release this advancement. So then there's the question of an educational system that helps them advance in this process. And again, this is not just a personal advancement. They explore spiritual truth or spiritual concepts that relate to their identity. And then in expressing that capacity, they have the context of a neighborhood. The question of how do they now help the younger generations to also find that spiritual identity or serve the older generation so that even the relationships are redefined. So it's not so much of we have a youth population and we have children, but there's that intergenerational relationship that binds the community together.
I think in terms of just looking at the sort of history of humanity, this is one of the most difficult times for young people. They're facing so many challenges across the globe, and their challenges are so much more complex than past generations. And so in order to really help a generation come up that will in many ways have to help humanity overcome these challenges, then they have to be able to access these two systems of knowledge, of science and religion. And so that happens at such an early age, especially within a home context, when a family is helping the children access knowledge. But in the absence of that, they don't know where to seek knowledge. And I think that is really something that we're urgently concerned about. And so even if we look at how a young person at 11 or 12 is starting to ask questions about what are those talents that God gave me, and how can those talents contribute to the betterment of my society, to the betterment of my community, to the movement of my population. And to be able to identify those talents at 12 is quite profound. And then if we walk with them over the course of the entirety of their middle school and high school years, then they start to use those talents, pursue opportunities where they can actually start to develop those talents, and then in turn help the younger generations find those talents again. So in this way, it really begins to be a hope for the rising generation when I think so much of society and so many of our young people are feeling hopeless. And so it feels, at least in terms of what you're saying, in terms of the educational process, it's built in to the entire process of working with young people, is actually beginning to think about how to help them on a lifetime of service, where service is expressed in many different avenues, and one can apply the revelation of Baha'u'llah to many aspects of their life.
It's nice you mentioned about hope, right? And it's really interesting because youth, as we know, they are brimming with energy, right? And they're ready to take on the world. But yet more and more what many youth are starting to hear, especially in Asian countries, is what a difficult world we live in. So much so that you have to watch out for yourself. You have to fend for yourself and don't worry too much about what's out there. You can't do much about it. So I think now in more and more places in these Asian countries, engaging youth in a conversation about service has been so rewarding and has started to become like a conversation of hope to young people, right? And also when youth start to have a vision that they can contribute to something greater than themselves, even though they may be doing something small, but then these profound feelings of hope for a better future can inform the choices they make in their lives, right? And unfortunately as well, sometimes what is placed in front of youth is that they need to make choices when maybe they don't need to make those choices, right? So we could say that these choices could be between thinking about my own education versus thinking about my community, right? So why is it that it cannot be together, right? So I think more and more now we're learning that even for a youth to think about his community could constitute part of his education, right? Because we are now seeing when young people are serving their communities, they're part of these programs for moral and spiritual education, they develop so many wonderful qualities and attitudes.
The Baha'i community has been learning with others for some time about programs of education that will help release the potential of young people, moral and intellectual empowerment programs. And so it's given rise to a generation of young people. They're very eager to serve. So there's a very promising evidence of this transformation occurring now all around the world in all societies. But at the same time, we observe that many young people arise to serve, begin serving, but then at certain points, they're not able to sustain that sense of coherence and that meaningful kind of path of development. Maybe it's financial pressures at home cause them to choose to work full-time early, and that might disrupt their education or their ability to continue serving. So I think early on, the Baha'i community started to to kind of identify what concepts or capabilities actually help young people to navigate some of these challenges. And like one concept that has become important is this idea of true friendship. So friendship is not just relationships that are fun and entertaining and where we enjoy pastimes, but maybe young people become really inspired by this concept that true friendship are relationships through which we help each other to grow intellectually and spiritually, and that we encourage each other in approaching all aspects of our life in a spirit of service. I have this really nice kind of experiences with young people in my neighbourhood that I had been working with in the Junior Spiritual Empowerment Program. There's a small group of about 5 or so young men that are my neighbours. When we were reading the reality of our community, we could see that a lot of their younger peers, they're not really progressing as much as they need to be with their academic progress, reading and writing. In our community, many young people kind of learn the techniques and skills of reading, but they're really struggling to comprehend.
Yeah.
And reflecting on the situation, this group of young men, they felt a real close sense of love and care for some younger siblings or cousins or other neighbours. And in consultation, they decided to kind of set up a weekly tutorial group. They were familiar with the text of the Junior program, so they felt confident to kind of use these. So each one of them went out and spoke to 1 or 2 of these younger people that they know, spoke to their parents, and then they started to meet every week. But what started to happen was that these youth, 15, 16, they became so much more responsible. They became so much more conscious of their language. And it was just so clear that when they were then trying to help their younger friends read and comprehend and carry out these exercises well, you could see that they were progressing as well in their own comprehension and their own intellectual development. So I think this is just a really nice example of how the well-being and progress of individuals is tied to the extent to which they're serving others and caring for others. So I think this is something we want to really learn more about.
I'm going to give you each a word. So, for you, your word is peace.
Peace.
Honesty.
Law of peace.
And honesty.
Honesty.
I started to see in some communities where these community building activities start to have a particular pattern. Young people are at the front, starting to serve their communities. In recent years, I noticed the weddings also start to change a little bit. Now that when they are getting married, they feel they can serve at a higher level, right? So it's really nice to see how young people are starting to see how, really as service is at the center, many things start to fall in place and many things also become redefined, right? And I mean, it's such a bright future when we think that when people are getting married, starting families, they are thinking about service. They're not just thinking about themselves and, protecting their small little unit, but thinking about their communities.
There was a letter from the Universal House of Justice. There's paragraphs that help a married couple think about their finances in a very principled way, or think about the role of extended family, or the role of raising children. And I think each of these paragraphs are really, such a profound opportunity for youth, married families to think about a coherent life, because everyone has a part to play in the caring of a home, of a family. And so I think even just beginning to see this generation of families that are serving together, where their children find at the youngest age such joy in service with their parents, I think even takes us on an even more profound journey of where these children will be in 20 years in terms of how they even understand the concept of service. Because from the youngest age, they're being raised in that. And it's not just a few people, it's entire groups of families.
I feel like we talked a bit about maybe some of these elements that we're learning are contributing to the coherent spiritual and intellectual progress of youth. I wonder if we can talk more about the intellectual development of youth and what we're seeing is important.
I think one of the most powerful examples that we've had in recent years is the Institute for Global Prosperity. This institute has helped so many young people to begin to think about how their interaction with their studies can actually start to be pursued in a way where service is at the center. But there's so many questions that face, college students that are very difficult questions. This path that youth now have for 4 years of their undergraduate studies is really profound because they can bring those difficult questions to a cohort of their friends over the course of their studies and identify, again, going back to those talents, how do they now use those talents and develop these intellectual capacities that will help them even sort of combat these forces that you were talking about earlier. This sort of overemphasis of one's identity as opposed to really beginning to think about one's relationship to others and service to others. And so I don't know what your experience has been, but I think that this particular area has contributed a lot to the coherent life of young people.
We have some really rural areas, for example, in the Philippines, where it's just a lack of role models, so to speak. Like sometimes when you've not experienced it, if you're not seen it in your immediate environment, at times it's hard for the youth to imagine the possibilities. So for example, we're working with one area where they've not really seen so many university graduates or people pursuing a profession. How else can we help the youth apart from the spaces that we already have, helping them spiritually, but also those that address their intellectual needs?
One of the challenges that we see in a lot of our communities where access to higher education isn't as easy, when a student goes to higher education, they're more likely to fail out of the university because they weren't prepared for the university setting. And so actually this mentorship, this idea of someone older than you, helping you even navigate what your first year of university might be like. Is that the right university where you will be successful? Like there are so many of these questions. And so they need the support of a community of others who can actually help them figure out what is it that you need to do to navigate that university space.
Yeah, so you were mentioning about these seminars by the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity for university students. So many youth find so much clarity in their thought thinking about their lives through these seminars. I recall there's this youth who, after participating in gatherings, he started to create these regular gatherings. More and more youth are starting to explore that science and religion, while they may look like they are going separate ways, but if we bring them into conversation, there's really so much we can talk about. This gathering is picking up momentum and more youth wish to participate. And I think really those who come and participate, sometimes they have certain views, but then in such spaces, they start to realize that, maybe we should explore more also what religion has to offer, but in a way that it does not label people, but how do we see religion as sources of insight, like the way we see science as a source of knowledge.
There's so many different ways in which the revelation is applied within all of these fields that allow for them to think more deeply and more broadly about any given topic. Whereas I think the polarization of society is saying you can only think about it in these narrow confines. But actually, there's just so many different ways we can pursue truth together. And so I think that these spaces on university campuses, devotional gatherings, it seems like one of the things that's happening a lot is young people are coming together for prayers, and then they'll have these deeper discussions around topics that they're facing. We have a series of youth conferences in our region. What's significant about that is they're studying the message from the Universal House of Justice to the American Bahá'í community that really talks about this question of racial injustice. And that particular conference, gathering together youth, they begin to see that the work that they're doing is in a context, especially in our country, to really build a new society that is a society that has oneness at the center, and is not a society that's supporting otherness and forcing us to divide, but rather to come together and yet celebrate the diversity of our nation, to celebrate different perspectives and different ways of looking at things, that yet within a common framework.
The youth facing challenges of anxiety or depression or loneliness are so distinct for this generation. We really had to navigate how to help them, how to support them. It's something that's very new in the Philippines for a very communal setting. And I think most of the countries in Southeast Asia, we share that very communal identity. But then, as we say, these forces have really penetrated across the world. So, just having, in the form of a study circle, for example, and exploring concepts that speak to their reality and remind them who they are, remind them of their nobility, for example, and then exploring this with others, because change is not really brought about by individual efforts, but it's in a collective setting. Having that group where you are exploring your true identity together and then expressing it in the field of service, it's helping them a lot to combat these feelings of loneliness and having a shared sense of purpose.
When groups of youth, or at least when the environment is conducive for youth to come together, then really they start to have a different experience. If someone chooses to put his phone down on his own, that means he must have found something which is more meaningful, more enjoyable, And we know that, these gadgets and all, they keep us there, but we're not necessarily happy on them, right? But then in these groups of youth, who are starting to study together, thinking about their neighborhood together, engaging in service to their neighborhoods, like this seems to draw them more, right? This idea of service, and the phone is still there, it's still needed from time to time, but somehow they've started to chart a new path of, that technology is there. I don't need to be a slave to this technology, but rather how technology can also help me or help us in our service to the community.
I think this challenge affecting many societies of young people, really this growing rates of anxiety and depression. Obviously, social connection is part of the solution, but I think another really important part of it is identity and a sense of self. We talked about how young people growing up today, they're really aggressively targeted by these forces of education through social media, through advertising, through film and all forms of media. And to achieve their purpose, they have to look a certain way, they have to be popular, they have to live up to certain impossible social constructs, which are essentially just sending them down this path of just being a consumer and in pursuit of that impossible ideal. But then if they can't live up to these standards of beauty, the standards of popularity, intelligence, wealth, then they really, at the age of 12, 13, they think, who am I? What am I? I'm nothing, I'm no one. And so then this creates these really heartbreaking situations. So the Junior Spiritual Empowerment Program, it's giving young people an interaction with, a learning process where they're discovering a human being is a soul, is a mind, is capable of beauty in terms of the acquisition of these qualities of truthfulness, of love, of compassion, of generosity. And they discover this is who I am, this is what I can be. And then in the social environment of a junior youth group, there is true friendship, free from judgment. We can make mistakes, we don't tease each other. And so they develop this true sense of self, such that when they do face challenges in life, they can rely on prayer, but they just know that they're noble, that they're important, and that they can find joy and fulfillment in service to others. And it's giving hope, which is really hard to find at the moment elsewhere.
When you turn to others to help others, your hardship and your, sort of all of those things start to go away. It's like finding that service is the greatest healing medicine for humanity.
You've been listening to In Conversation, a podcast series from the Baha'i World News Service. For more podcasts and stories, visit bwns.org.